Does the public really give those surveys that have been done for a year leading up to the election and now getting so close to the big day on November 6th? Caught up with conservative pollster Fritz Wenzel this past week and says at this point it is really way too close to call.
What's happening is you've got a level of support that's really solid, but then this group of, I think, 12 to 15% of the electorate who are made up of people who will vote, but they're just soft support. They're just not sure who they want to vote for yet. It's very unusual that you'd have such a large pool, but that's why you have this flop from Obama to Romney. It'll probably go back to Obama, and then it may split up. Who knows?
And then you have their staffers on each side, Fritz, saying, well, at the outset, or at least when the president had this lead for such a long period of time, it was the Romney people who said, listen, you can't trust the polls. And now I'm hearing the Obama folks saying the same thing.
Yeah.
You can't necessarily trust them. How accurate are polls? You're a pollster. You make your living.
Yeah.
How accurate are they, especially getting closer to crunch time on November 6th?
Well, first of all, I think all the pollsters are doing a good job. It's just that they're doing different things. And that's why you really have to look underneath the hood. You can't just look at the top line and say, well, that's where the race is. Some pollsters poll registered voters.
Right.
Other pollsters poll likely voters. And there's a huge difference between the two. Registered voters are just not as plugged in to what's going on a day-to-day basis. And there are other methodologies, how many Democrats are in a poll versus how many Republicans.
All right, let's take a look at some of those polls, and
okay.
I think you'll know if these are registered or likely voters. The first one, Fritz, this past week, the CNN ORC poll, and this is broken down into Ohio specifically. The president had an 8-point lead that shrinks down to 4%, just outside the margin of error. Break that down for us.
Well, what I think you're seeing in this poll is that you've probably got many more Democrats than Republicans in the survey, because the CNN polls do not do what we call weighting a poll for partisan affiliation. They just take whatever they get in their sample.
But what's the point then? If you don't break it down evenly?
I don't think there is a point, and that's why we do weight for partisan affiliation. It's based on this very old theory from the 60s or 70s that you really don't have to consider party affiliation, because we weren't a very political nation back in the 60s and the 70s. I mean, there were political fights, but we really became a hyper-partisan nation in the early 1990s. And since then, it's been important to weight your polls because we're so divided.
Yeah.
It's always going to be that way. But the old line pollsters, all the network pollsters, Gallup, Lewis Harris and Associates, do not wait for party affiliation because they're doing things the way they always used to do things. New pollsters, including Wenzel Strategies, do wait for party.
It almost seems like you're kind of doing a disservice. It's such a broad brush that you have to break it down specifically.
Yeah.
We've got
there's one other point here. There are media pollsters, and then there are political pollsters who have political clients, and that's what I do.
One, right?
And that we just have, I think, more of a burden to be hyper accurate compared to the media pollsters who don't have that burden.
Okay. Do you now? Some have the title of Republican or conservative pollster. You represent certainly Republican candidates.
Yeah, we work on the Republican side of the aisle.
So how do you know for sure when you go to Wenzel Strategies, you go to Rasmussen, which tends to lean right, correct?
Right.
Certainly a Fox News poll. How do you know that you're going to be accurate? Fox News is going to be accurate.
We all publish a list of details about who was included in our poll, including how many Democrats, how many Republicans, how many men, how many women, the age of the respondents, et cetera, et cetera. So just look. You just have to look. I think the media could do a real service by telling people real quickly what percentage Democrats, what percentage Republicans and independents are included in the polls. If you just throw that down at the bottom of your screen.
I'll keep that in mind. The next time we have a 20-second VO in the 11 o'clock news, the 6 o'clock news, include how many Democrats and independents
you have to include
as well.
them.
All right, let's probably more important than ever to include independents, right? Who are going to decide this election. Okay, this one really raised a lot of eyebrows early in the week, Fritz, the Pew Research Center poll. And this really really generated some headlines and a lot of Mitt Menem, if you will, for Mitt Romney. And this, I believe, these were likely voters, this particular poll.
And this sample also included more Republicans than Democrats. This is a very close race. It's a 1-point race one way or the other. So you just, sadly, each poll is so different. It's like comparing a Ferrari and a Corvette. I mean, you got to look under the hood.
How important is it, the polls, they go to the media, we get the story out. Can it drive somebody to say, well, I want to go with the winner?
Yeah,
I mean, how important
exactly.
is that?
And that's exactly what's going on. I think you've got maybe 2 or 3% of the electorate who's in play at any given time, especially coming up to Election Day, and will listen to the polls and either vote or not vote or change their vote because of what the polls are saying.
All right, so here we are. We've got now coming up on 3 weeks before Election Day. You represent a number of clients, and Ron Paul, probably the most famous of which.
Yeah, probably.
But some other pretty big names too. So 3 weeks in, how many more surveys will you do leading up to Election Day?
We'll probably do 50 more
that
polls.
Many? That many?
Yeah, a lot of it's going to be tracking polls in Senate races or congressional races across the country. We're kind of getting ready to flip over to daily tracking, and what we do is we work very closely with the media companies so that we can tell if a particular commercial that's now on the air is working or whether we need to change the messaging or whatnot. So we work hand in glove with the media companies.
All right, and when you call, who is more likely to pick up the phone and say, yeah, I'll take 10 or 15 minutes to talk with you because we don't have time in the day, Fritz?
Yeah, and usually our polls are shorter than that.
Okay.
Now we're doing much shorter polls than we did
Especially for
5
tracking
years.
polls, I would imagine,
Yeah,
daily
very
tracking?
quickly. It's like a minute and a half to take a tracking poll.
Wow, that quickly?
Very quickly.
Okay, I'm on the phone. You're calling me. What are you going to ask me?
Well, we're going to ask you, first of all, are you likely to vote? Do you feel things are headed in the right direction, or are they off on the wrong track? We're going to ask your favorability. Do you have a favorable or an unfavorable opinion of Barack Obama, of Mitt Romney? Then if we have a Senate candidate, we'll ask them too. And then we'll say, if the election was today, for whom would you vote?
Yeah, and you're going to ask about party affiliation, obviously.
Oh. Yeah.
So there you have it. If the election was held today, for whom would you vote? Of course, it's not today. It's 3 weeks and 2 days away now as we're here on this Sunday morning. Melissa Miller, we're talking about, as we did with Fritz, someone sees the poll that says, that Pew poll, that Mitt Romney has overtaken President Obama, and you say some people will actually look at a poll and say, well, my guy can't win, so I'm not going to vote?
Although I would advise them, looking at that Pew poll, that's right at about the margin of error.
Right.
Fritz as well knows, gosh, when you're within that margin of error, you call it a statistical dead heat. That problem, though, we can see if someone takes a 6, 7, 8-point lead, then the opponent has trouble getting their troops to the polls to actually vote because it looks like, gosh, we can't win it. So this race, where these polls are either 1 to 3, the Pew poll was very tight, that tends to drive up turnout because people think my vote could really make a difference.
It does count. That CNN ORC poll had Mr. Obama leading by 4 percentage points from 8 back in August.
Right. I would not have predicted the kind of, we've seen the up and down with the polls. We tend to see more steady movement. The polls this time around seem to be so sensitive to a convention speech. We got that, there wasn't much of a bounce for the Republicans, but then the Democrats got a convention bounce. Then we got the first debate in Denver, which was a dud by all accounts.
Huge for Romney.
The Democratic convention bounce was wiped out. We'll be waiting till about midweek, I would argue. About Tuesday, Wednesday, we'll see if the vice presidential debate impacted those poll numbers at all. I'd say maybe a point. I don't see we'll see nearly the shift.
Basically a push, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say we'd see nearly the shift we saw after Denver when the polls really responded to Romney's really strong performance and the president's weak performance.
All right, and looking ahead to the next presidential debate this coming week, a couple of days out, a town hall style debate, totally different from what we saw. Jim Blair moderates and the candidates, standing at the lectern. This one a little bit different. What do you anticipate?
This one is different, and I'd say 6 months ago what I've said Obama has the advantage because people tend to think he's more like me. They find him to be more charming than Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney has typically been seeming kind of wooden, and then came Denver, and Romney turned it on. And so now I'm sort of like, all bets are off.
Yeah.
I'll be very curious to see. I think one thing is that people are tuning in more for these debates than you'd expect when it's a race with an incumbent president. Interest tends to be a little lower when an incumbent is running than when it's a wide open race. But this time around, because it's such a dead heat, and the president opens up a lead and then it comes back, I mean, it's really keeping voter interest, I think, quite high.
You mentioned the entertainment factor that goes into these debates, but there was a lot of substance last night, or I should say as we tape here on Friday. Foreign policy really drove the first part of that debate. Coming up, it may run the gamut, and then we're hearing a lot about the deficit and the $500 trillion tax cut that the president is hammering Romney on. So how much do the details, the substance, do those details matter, I guess?
The details definitely matter, and voters have been asking for more details. One interesting thing about the town hall, the format typically is that swing voters in the middle, undecided in the voters in the middle will be there as part of the debate, talking to the candidates. Often they're putting forward questions, and I'll bet that those questions will be pretty substantive from regular voters.